for today, I thought it would be mostly about facts, like what's the discussion about what's happening. And I found this reading, this thing, grading China's Belt and Road. Yeah, make sure, test it, yeah, because, okay. So, thanks.
Oh, that's the good tea.
Yeah. Somebody has to be. So I found this reading about the Belt and Road project, and it's not the greatest. I mean, none of these readings are that great about Belt and Road because it's an empirical. I mean, there are a bunch of empirical questions, and there's not one answer. But I thought, good morning, Milton. I thought this one was kind of useful because they developed this checklist idea. So their idea is Belt and Road projects raise this list of concerns, and then it's a way to grade a particular project. So you could look at the dam that was built in Ecuador, and you could go through their checklist and say, okay, how does it look? And the checklist, I think, is pretty much common sense. It's pretty much what you would care about for thinking about Belt and Road projects. And I honestly don't know exactly what the issue of joining the Belt and Road, officially joining. It's like now Xi Jinping has like a sign-up list, and you sign up to be a member of the Belt and Road. I don't know exactly what that's about. Like, I'm sure if you are if some country is not a member of the Belt and Road, they could still get a Chinese investment project if they want one. I mean, if South Africa wants to have a railroad, I'm sure China would build it, even if they're not technically a member of the Belt and Road group. But maybe not. I actually don't know. My suspicion is that that's kind of the political side of it, that it would be sort of related to the BRICS idea. And I think Xi Jinping's idea of the BRICS is as a group that he leads. Right? I don't think it's about South sharing or whatever from his point of view. Now, other people have their other purposes, but so maybe maybe joining officially the Belt and Road thing is important for him and for China, sort of politically, personally. It shows how many countries in the world are on their team or something like that. That's kind of my guess, but I don't know.
I don't know.
Oh, thank you. So I'll just write these up here and just summarize what I can't write the whole thing, but so the first one is, and I'll just, these all have question marks after them, right? What does this do? What does this deal do to a country's sovereignty? And some of them might be sovereignty sort of concerning, and others not. I'll give you their example. What they often, if you read their case studies in here, it's often about who controls the deal, or who controls the infrastructure that's been built. So I think one of the examples of concern was the project in Sri Lanka, where the Chinese partners were state-owned enterprises. So you're sort of dealing directly with the Chinese government, and then they had a majority stake in the joint venture that was set up. And for this group of, for these analysts, that's more concerning than if it's just a kind of normal commercial project. And some of these deals look more like normal commercial projects. There's a Chinese sort of private company, and no company in China is really private, but some are more private than others. Sometimes you're dealing directly with the state. Right, and that also, I think, one of the factors that concerns sovereignty or is relevant for the sovereignty thing is it just a construction investment where then they go home, or is it a construction and operation kind of deal? So, I think people said in Brazil, some of the projects involve China constructing electrical generation or something and then operating the facility for a certain number of years. And you can see why, from the Chinese point of view, that makes sense, because they want to get paid back, and if they operate it, they get fees from operation, and that helps repay. On the other hand, if you could say, well, we don't want some foreign government running our electrical grid. So transparency the deals here vary quite a bit in terms of how transparent the transactions are. How much, and a lot of it is how much did the local government insist on transparency when it entered into this project? And there's a range, right? Some governments, I think, the sitting government probably thought that there would be political controversy, so they just do these deals sort of directly, privately with the Chinese government, and they don't release documents. They don't have open bidding processes. Some of the projects are very non-transparent. Hey, good morning. And others are more transparent. And I think, again, that will depend on the local government trying to insist on transparency. Good morning. Yeah, so they're discussing one in Burma here. They're saying this project mirrors concerns over this larger project for which no budget estimates or feasibility studies have been completed, and none of the 15 memoranda signed between Burma and China, none of the 15 memoranda have been released to the public. And so, if it's a private deal, that's sort of normal, right? Private companies doing deals, they don't make their documents public, and the contracts are hard to find. But these are public deals, right? So transparency is obviously a big one. Financial sustainability, I'll just put sustain. And that goes to the merits of the economic merits of the transaction. Like, is it realistic? Because one of the concerns is this debt trap critique, which is that some of the projects, if you believe in the conspiracy theory about the Chinese government, then they could design projects to not be economically sustainable, and then their remedy is to take ownership of the asset, which would be kind of normal in a commercial context. But in a commercial context, you probably wouldn't do that intentionally. You would want the project to be successful economically. You don't want to own you don't want to repossess the house if you're the bank, right? Then you own a house, and you're in the house owning business. So there are concerns that some of these deals are just not economically realistic. And then what happens? Because you're dealing with the Chinese state on the other side. And they're in the ones they've studied, a lot of them have cost overruns. So the projection is you have to borrow $2 billion from China, but then the project ends up costing $4 billion, which is also kind of normal in the business world. There are cost overruns all the time in contracts. But there's this concern that that's a different kind of problem with these deals. So, and that's an interesting one. Yeah, let's see. Local engagement. And these are all concerns that are not new, and they're not specific to China. These are old concerns about foreign investment in general. what are the benefits coming to the local country? So is the Chinese side going to supply all the management, all the engineers, and a bunch of the employees, and just have the local people be like security guards and working in the restaurants? I mean, it sounds like some of the projects in Africa have been kind of like that. So then there's no technology transfer, and in the literature about foreign direct investment, going back years and years, it's pretty clear that countries that used foreign direct investment successfully, part of the strategy was to make sure that technology was transferred, so that not only through like technology transfer contracts, but also tacit, what we call know-how. Like a lot of technology is actually knowing how to do stuff, and not you can't patent that. People have to learn that, and then they can go do it themselves. And that's certainly what China has done very well, right? If you wanted to have a foreign investment project in China, for years, you had to have a joint venture, and you had to be the minority partner in the joint venture. And they made sure that you were hiring Chinese people, and Chinese people were learning to do what you did. And that's why they could eventually kick out the foreign partners and then export on their own, because they learned how to do whatever it was. So that's a question with these projects. That's an empirical question, because that's part of the development process is training your workforce to know how to do stuff. And in Asia, that's been very common. I mean, the Korean companies got going, several of them got going during the Vietnam War as like subcontractors to the US government. So Hyundai, for example, how did they learn how to build ports and airports and roads? They built them for the American government in Vietnam or in the Middle East before the Shah, when Iran was still sort of in the Western thing, and Iran and other countries were building oil fields and ports and all those things. The Koreans got in, the big Korean companies got in because they were cheap and they were fast. And the American companies, Halliburton and those people they may have been like the prime contractors, but the Korean companies got in as subcontractors, and that's how they learned to build big infrastructure projects. Korea didn't have that expertise. Samsung started out as they refined sugar. They were like a food company, and now they're Samsung, right? So there's a lot of learning that goes into that, and so to me, that's kind of what China, that's the situation now. So now China they're still kind of they're not probably the cheapest, but that's their game, I would say, is to be cheaper than the Japanese or the Koreans, cheaper, faster. But you would want to make sure that your people were learning how they do it, because otherwise, I don't think they're going to transfer it voluntarily.
What you're saying is that countries should apply the same idea or strategy against China that China used against
Korea, and I mean, my career, yeah. I mean, well, and so this is where sometimes people get really mad at me, because I say one thing about Trump, his America First stuff. I mean, that's sort of why we elect presidents. We don't elect them to serve other people's interests. We elect them to serve our interests. Now, for me, our interests include global relations. So it's not isolationism. But it is thinking, well, what's Trump's job? Trump's job is to try to benefit the U.S. That's why I elected. I didn't elect him, but that's why anybody is elected in a democracy, is to look out for their country first, I think. So yeah, and the way my view of development strategies is that the only one that's worked really effectively was East Asia. to really go from being a very, very poor countries to very wealthy countries in 50 years.
Which would include China.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not the same, but to me, they followed the path of, they learned from watching Japan and Korea and especially Taiwan. And they watched them closely. So, you talk to people in China, and one of their complaints was, we don't have any global brands. The Koreans have global brands. The Japanese have some global brands. We should have global brands too. And I would say, well, look at Taiwan. Taiwan doesn't really have global brands in the same way. I mean, they have companies that control huge parts of the actual world. I mean, but it's semiconductors or something like that, and nobody knows the names of those companies. And that's a slightly different model. But the Chinese, they have been very interested in being more like Korea, so that there would be world famous brands that were Chinese. It seems like kind of a weird thing to care about. Like, who cares? But people care. And if you talk to people, I went one time, and they were doing that with cars. They were saying, well, we don't have any world famous car brands, and that's a problem for some reason. And I said, well, you can buy shares in Volkswagen. Volkswagen produces in China. You want to own a famous brand, buy some shares in Volkswagen. They're like, no, that's not what we mean. So
They want the brand to be Chinese.
they want the Chinese brand, and it has something to do with national pride or something like that. I don't know if you get richer. I mean, if you compare GDP per capita, I think Taiwan and Korea compete against each other vigorously, which is actually, I think, a bad thing. Like, rationally, you'd think those two places should be working together because they have a lot of common issues. But there's a lot of rivalry between those two, and yeah. But I think Taiwan is actually a little ahead now in per capita GDP, and they've done it being mostly subcontractors or sort of. So it's a different model. But the Chinese is very, it's very much, we want Samsung or Hyundai. We want Huawei to be like Samsung or something like that. I don't know if they'll succeed or not, and I don't know if it makes any difference.
And the funny thing is that when you talk to Chinese to have their perspective on those kind of things, they are very intense and they do believe that they are growing very fast. So all the Chineses that I work with, they are sure that there is I don't remember the name of the car factory and the car brand, but they have a brand in China that is competing directly with Tesla.
BYD.
It's not BYD. It's BYD. It's not in the Tesla level.
Show me.
They do have
Show me.
fintech cars. They are competing locally
Yeah.
with Tesla,
Let's
and
see.
they do believe that this is growing so fast that in like 3 years they can be at the same level of
Like premium
Yeah.
quality.
Yeah.
recognizement of Tesla. And they do believe in that, and they think that we all know about that, and we actually have never heard about any of those special
Yeah.
things.
So the car.
Work for them, you should see.
Yeah.
Sure, for sure.
The car
I've
thing.
heard about it like once in a paper, but I have never seen a car like that.
So if you want to cause trouble, ask them whether that company is actually profitable or not. Because a lot of the scare stories you read in the newspaper, it's like the reporters. So we're going to talk about the importance of like finance tonight. A lot of the reporters, half of them will write a story, and the metric for growth is sales, raw sales, not profitability. And then you'll read a different article, and it'll say, well, yeah, none of these electric car companies in China are actually profitable. So, and why is that? It's because it's disorganized. They have too many companies, and they compete. Well, they're all trying to grow. They're all in this maximum growth of sales model, so they're cutting their prices. So the competition internally in China is crazy, apparently. So none of them are making money.
Is the same what they're doing here with food delivery market? With the enter of Kita, it's from Meituan.
Yeah.
And the Didi, that is the owner of 99 for
Right.
years.
Yeah.
And what they do is that they come here, they the technology, the know-how, and they have 2 or 3 Brazilian people working here to say that the company is Brazilian. And they adapt here their names and everything to make look it is a Brazilian brand,
Right.
but it only has Chinese know-how, technology, and they are fighting so hard with each other that they don't care about other competitors. Like, for example, if you go to Akira employee and you ask them about iFood, which is the biggest brand of food delivery in Brazil, they don't care about it. They only care about the 990 DD metrics, and that's their fight that they have between them. And they're lowering so much their prices that some experts say that they will only be profitable from 5-10 years from now.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit a couple classes ago when we talked about dumping. You know, when is dumping actually? When does it actually happen? And is it ever rational? And should you care if somebody is dumping products into your market? This thing of, I mean, it's kind of disruptive for the world to have this going on. You know, they're I mean, if they're not, you know, in a normal market economy, I guess you can go for a while unprofitably. I mean, a lot of the big American tech companies were unprofitable for a while, but the venture capitalists would invest anyway, even though the company isn't actually making a profit. But it does raise a question: how? What?
John, the money is private, right?
Yeah.
You ruin the, you know, if you, because in Brazil we had situations in which the government gave money.
Yeah.
Then the company went bankrupt. Then it's the taxpayers' money. Or in China, I'm not sure if those companies that are not having profit are governmental or.
My suspicion is that they're subsidized somehow by some unit of the government. I would guess with car companies, because car companies, I mean, for venture capitalists or somebody like to fund a whole car thing that's not profitable, that's not at least the model in the U.S. Like, hey, good morning. You know, they might fund a tech startup where there are 5 people writing code, you know, and it's not that, the costs aren't that much. I suspect that those unprofitable car companies are being subsidized somehow by local governments, or, you know, probably more local governments, because as we talked about yesterday, you know, the Chinese government officials at the lower level are still graded kind of on the GDP growth in their area. So there's a symbiotic relationship between local governments and manufacturing. And this has been a problem for a long time. China, I don't think, really ever rationalized its car industry. The car industry, they used to have like 50 car companies or something. The car companies, after the communists took over, you know, during their style of industrialization, wasn't on economic principles. They just opened there were car companies all over China that were all small. They weren't rational, and that they didn't have any technology either. So when I went there in the 80s, the cars, nobody had cars, but the government official cars were these old Soviet models, like from the 1950s. That was the level of technology, and then they were being built all over China by different companies. So it was a very strange model. I don't know why they did that.
It was similar in Brazil to former government, right? In the 90s. So in Brazil, we opened the market for import of cars from outside.
In the 90s?
In the 90s.
Yeah. So before that, there were lots of small Brazilian brands. Yeah.
I don't think it was a lot.
No, yeah. I mean, we had this policy of that we're trying now in the U.S.
Oh, self-sufficiency? Yeah.
So protecting national industry.
Right.
Creating subsidies or avoiding accepting transfer of technology if the technology is available in Brazil. It was
right.
And our patent office needed to register the agreement to allow the foreigner to send the money away.
Oh yeah.
You know,
That's what I worked with in Korea. The Koreans were still doing that. So I know all about that.
Koreans are still doing it?
Well, they're not still doing well. The rules and the institutions are still there. They didn't really abolish them. They they don't enforce them the same way they used to, but they could. I mean, I think they still have a Foreign Exchange Control Act that allows the government to force people to convert their currency. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is how this stuff went around the world, because it was everywhere in the 50s and 60s. And you look at old law books, old like international commercial law books from that era, and that was just kind of normal. It was like 5-year plans. Everybody had 5-year plans. The Koreans had 5-year plans. They weren't exactly like Soviet 5-year plans, but and yeah.
But
So
the thing is, as my dad says, in Asia they plan and they apply.
yeah, right. Right.
Here they plan, but that's the beauty of. I mean, I don't admire that much, but but admire this. That they stick to the plan and they.
Well, the other thing, I think the key thing for me is the export orientation. And because that changes everything. Like if and Korea is like the clearest story. I mean, the President Park used to have meetings that he would chair with the leaders of the big companies. So, and then they would have, I mean, the deal was if you wanted access to foreign exchange, if you wanted permission to import technology or whatever, you had to show that you were exporting. So, and that's very different from this kind of it was self-sufficiency in a way, but it was always tied to exporting to the global markets, and not to poor countries, but to wealthy countries, right? They wanted to export to the US. So if you wanted to export to the US or Europe, you had to make good products, right? And they did. So that, the Japanese killed our auto industry not by cheating, but by exporting good cars that we bought. So, but a big country like Brazil, I can see why you thought, well, maybe we don't really need to be, dependent on exports, because we have a big market. We can, we have enough people internally. But like, Korea and Japan and Taiwan aren't that big. So I think the export orientation was probably necessary for them in a way. I mean, but Japan's a pretty big population. But
if you see the case of Chile, that the GDP per capita is double of Brazil.
Is it now?
Yeah. Uruguay and Chile, for different reasons, Chile was open before. And the interesting part is that Pinochet was not the one who privatized them more, because he was a military. Military people, they don't privatize.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, just blah, blah, blah. But the social democrats, like Cardoso did here, and not for ideology, for pragmatism.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the export orientation model, if you're serious about it, then a bunch of other stuff follows. Like you have to invest in education and especially in STEM, because otherwise you can't possibly move up the technology chain in the world, But in the 90s, every contract had to be approved by the government. So if you wanted to license technology from Japan, I mean, the government had to approve the deal, and what the government's role was to get better terms for the Korean importer. So the government would say, well, you'd sign a contract between a Korean company importing like pharmaceutical technology, and so they'd sign a contract, and the contract would have like a length, how many years, and then it would have a royalty rate. And then you'd submit this to the government, and the government guys would say, well, maybe you should lower the royalty rate, and maybe you should have a shorter duration. and then at the end of it, there has to be a technology transfer. Yeah, and so we would tell our clients, you know, and the intellectual property enforcement regime was bad. So we would tell our clients, if they were the foreigners, we'd say, well, basically, you need to understand this as a sale of your technology. You are not going to get it back, and you are not going to be able to stop the licensee from using it after the license is over. You just need to kind of understand that and then price it accordingly. So, because we try sometimes to get, you know, a license would end, and the contract would say, oh, now the Korean licensee must return the tools to the licensor. And it's like, no, you could not get the Korean police and prosecutors to actually take back the technology. And that was like physical technology. Yeah. Oh, sure. I mean, yeah. No, that's one reason why we have laws like 301. I mean, there was Super 301, there was Special 301 back in the 80s and 90s, and those are mostly aimed at like Korea and Taiwan and Japan. China was not a factor, but they were, because that whole thing was seen as kind of a non-tariff barrier somehow. It was, and if you know the 301 terms, it's sort of like, is some other country treating American business unfairly, or, you know, and they would say, well, yeah, that's kind of unfair. You know, you can't, you're forcing companies to change the terms of commercial deals, and this is, you know, so China has always done this, but with China, the Westerners came up with a new term, which was forced technology transfer. So the Germans and the Europeans, you know, they started writing about forced technology transfer. It was never forced. It was, you didn't have to do the deal. If the government said, you know, you can only charge a 5% royalty on the technology, then it was your choice. You could do it or not do it. But calling it forced technology transfer made it sound like the Chinese government was forcing foreign companies to give up their technology. They weren't doing that. But it was, the way they put it was trading technology for market access. If you want access to our market, you have to give up some of your technology. But that's what other countries in Asia had done too. You know,
and it ended up always receiving a second quality technology, because then the owner would say, well, if I'm gonna lose, you know, so take the second.
Well, that's why. Yeah, I mean that's the issue, right? It's but the way I think, so like the Korean car companies all used to be tied up with a foreign car company. Like they didn't have their own car companies, you know, until probably the 1960s, and they would tie up. So I think Hyundai was tied up with Toyota. Daewoo used to be a Korean company. Daewoo blew up and doesn't exist anymore. Daewoo was tied up with General Motors, and that was one of their complaints. But if you study it, that's how they moved up the technology chain. They started by importing most of the components from Japan. So they would import what we call the drivetrain in English. You know, the engine, the transmission, all that stuff would be imported as a kit at the beginning. And then what the Korean car companies did was mostly like put it together and maybe change the body style a little bit. But if you bought it old, and it was always older technology. Like, of course, the Japanese would not transfer their best technology to the Koreans, but they would transfer decent technology, and then it was just older. And then the Koreans, you know, everybody knew what was going on. So the Koreans, I think, thought, well, we don't want to be in this relationship forever. This is kind of a colonial relationship or something, you know, and we want to get out of it. So how do you get out of it? You make your own technology better, or you copy it. You reverse engineer Toyota's engine and figure out how they make such good engines, and then you make it yourselves. So, and that's, you know, it's industry by industry. I mean, when like I said, when I was there in the 90s, the Korean shipbuilding industry was just becoming competitive. Like the Japanese really still dominated shipbuilding. The Chinese weren't even in the picture in the 90s. And the Koreans' advantage was that they were cheap and fast. So I did a closing for Shell on a big tanker that was built in the Korean shipyard. And the Shell people were going to, they don't buy anything. They all lease to these long-term leases and whatever. But they were taking possession of the ship in the Korean shipyard, and then immediately they were going to sail it down to Singapore to get like the finishing stuff done by a different shipyard in Singapore because they were better. The Koreans, one of the Shell guys said it's like farmers built this ship, you know, and that wasn't the compliment. But it was cheap and it was fast and it was good enough. You know, it's just carrying oil, so it was good enough. But that's how the Koreans got into the shipbuilding industry too. It was by being cheap and fast. And you know, and now China has kind of done that to them, right? So the Koreans.
Unions and laws, right? Otherwise, no labor unions and no labor laws.
Yeah, they had labor unions, and labor relations were pretty violent in Korea, more violent than in Japan. Japan figured out some way to have important labor unions, and they negotiate things out, and it's generally pretty peaceful. And it's kind of a miracle how they do that, but Korea was not successful like that. There was a lot of violence in Korea, and that's one thing the authoritarian government did. You know, they would suppress unions, and if people who've studied it, you know, it said, well, wages kept rising. As the country got richer, wages rose, but they tended to not rise faster than productivity. So the manufacturing was becoming more productive. They were getting better. They were getting better technology, and they were exporting successfully, and wages rose along with that. But the wages never made things uncompetitive, right? And that's kind of a consensus in Korea. I mean, the left is pro-union and the right is whatever, but everybody sees Korea as kind of like a family business, and they're all in the same family. So if the companies become uncompetitive on global markets, that's a problem for everybody, including for the unions, right? If Samsung or Hyundai, like if Hyundai and Kia become uncompetitive on global markets because wages are too high, it's a big problem for everybody in Korea. And that's one of my, and it's true in Taiwan too. One of my friends in Taiwan is a law professor, and he said, John, in our politics, both parties are neoliberal. Like they both basically agree on the same economic policies. They fight about fake issues, like who's pro-China, which are fake issues. He said on the basic policy issues, they're all aligned. Taiwan they have to be exporting. They're going to be market oriented. They have to stay competitive on global markets, and that just because everybody kind of agrees with that, that constrains the policy swings. Like the left is never going to swing too far to the left. The right will never swing too far toward Trumpism or whatever. And that's kind of an interesting thing to see compared to other countries' politics, you know. But for them, so China, I mean, in some ways, when I look at China, it's like they're doing all the things that Korea and Taiwan and Japan did in the past. The issue is they're saying that they're going to be challenging the U.S. militarily also, and they're not our ally. You know, one reason you can explain sort of American, European attitudes toward Korea and Taiwan during the Cold War in Japan was, yeah, okay, they won't import our beef and they're protectionist and whatever, but still they're our allies, and that's a big deal in the Cold War. And you know, American foreign policy and American trade policy were, you know, never totally separate. But with China, it was always kind of a puzzle to me. It's like, why are we letting China do the same stuff, I sort of understand why we let our allies do this stuff, but why are we letting China do this stuff exactly? Because at the same time, they're sort of, Xi Jinping, he's like Khrushchev when he was pounding his shoe on the table and saying, we're going to bury you or something like that. It's like he's basically saying that you're not listening. So I don't know, here we are. I mean, if China were our ally in some geopolitical way, it would be different. But they're kind of signaling that they want to be a major military power and that they want to dominate the region. So, like their behavior in the South China Sea, they're basically saying we want to control that sea lane, and we're going to claim that that's all Chinese territory. And that's different, and they're a huge country, and so for them to have this obsession with exporting manufactured goods, it's a different kind of problem. The magnitude is just much bigger. So, yeah, do you have a question or comment?
So, I'm very curious about how the labor-government relationship is in China, because it's kind of contradictory for me looking outwards, because China, you have a communist party in China,
yeah,
and at the same time, there is a lot of scandal related to
yeah,
poor work conditions in China.
Yeah.
And if you can talk about
Yeah.
that.
No, yeah. They have what, and Korea did the same thing too. They have, if the political scientists used to write about the corporatism, right? Corporatism as an actual thing in governance. And Americans don't understand corporatism. The young people think it just means when corporations have a lot of power, that's corporatist or whatever. It drives me crazy. What? I have to explain this to my students. No, China, they have a corporatist labor governance system. So there's a nationally recognized umbrella union that's official. It's a government thing. And every union in the country has to belong to that. So, and so they have unions, but the function of the unions is really not the same as independent labor unions in a democracy. That the corporatist and Korea. So Korea wanted to do that, but the left in Korea and the labor people were strong enough. They always had independent unions, but they were illegal for long periods of time. I mean, they would have illegal unions, and because everybody considered the government union like a sham, like the government union is just part of the government. And I think they still have this. And they all had names, long names with Korean I think the government corporatist one was the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions or something like that. And your union had to be part of that. So it was like a pyramid structure. And the more serious left union people always considered that a sham, and they would, and then they would fight with the police. They would try to have their own union that was independent, and then if they had a strike, then the government would send in the police. And there was a lot of violence in Korea during the rapid growth period. It's better now, but yeah, there was a lot of violence, and then of course the right could always say, well, you guys, the independent union, you're actually being funded by the North Koreans, and you're making trouble because you're funded by the North Koreans, and you're trying to upset our system. And I would say there was some truth to that some of the further left union people were sort of communists. I mean, they sort of thought North Korea was the answer, and in Korean politics, that's toxic, right? If that sets off the right, and this is still going on. I mean, I think the president that was impeached, Yoon, I think Yoon was accusing some of the union people of being like pro-North Korea and like getting money from North Korea to help, stir up trouble. But I mean, the actual facts of that are highly contested. But yeah, so China has a corporatist labor union organization, and you can't.
So the party controls the union.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's not technically part of the party, but it's, I talked the other day about, for a while, there was a movement to separate the government from the party legally, so that the party would be more like a normal political party in another society. That's one thing that Xi Jinping has openly said, no, we're not doing that. They had a whole program of, the reformers had a program of separating the party from the government. So the government would be a more normal thing. There would be a civil service. You wouldn't have to be in the party to be in the government, and then the party would be separate, and the party could have internal rules, but those would be for party members. They wouldn't be law for everybody. And Xi Jinping has just collapsed them back together.
I think the Chinese government accept the full world conditions on China as a cost of development, and the workers can't organize themselves to demand some labor laws or something, or more protection. Or my view that there is a full work environment in China is not quite accurate. Well, it is the media that says that.
Oh, it depends on what sector you work in. China now, there's huge differences across different regions. I mean,
Like manufacturing or Foxconn.
there's clean, there's sort of clean manufacturing, but even the clean stuff, you work in a Foxconn thing, there are 400,000 employees or something, and you're living in dormitories, but at least you're not, you're physically, it's probably air conditioned and you're sitting there assembling stuff. But then there's still a lot of just hard physical labor. And yeah, and so in the US, on the trade political spectrum, the Democratic Party, their traditional position when they were sort of in favor of free trade, like Clinton or the sort of middle road Democrats, they would always try to put in some minimal labor standards in trade agreements. Because their view is that, well, it's kind of dumping, it's kind of cheating to be competitive because you're suppressing your workers. Like we don't want, or it's the same with the environment. It's like, it's sort of cheating for a country to be able to export because they don't care about their environment. So they're poisoning their environment. It makes their products cheaper. They're suppressing their workers. That makes their products cheaper. And then they're more competitive on our market. And so from that point of view, you want kind of global minimum labor standards. I mean, that's what the ILO, the International Labor Organization, is supposed to do, I guess, is to try to get minimum labor standards around the world. And from a trade perspective, that would kind of change. It would put a floor then under anybody's prices, right? Because anybody who's making stuff and exporting stuff would have to pay labor some reasonable wage and would have to have some kind of reasonable environmental protection. And you'd still have plenty of competition. Even if China stopped suppressing its workers, the wages would still be way below wages in the U.S. There was one old American statute. I don't think it's on the books anymore, but one of the old American statutes said the president would have the power to raise tariffs if the cost of production in a foreign country was lower than the cost of production in the U.S., then the U.S. president would have the power to raise the tariff to equalize. And I tell my students that would completely destroy international trade. Like that would, somebody makes something cheaper and our president Because okay, well, I'm going to put a tariff on to remove their cost advantage. I mean, that was a totally, it was way before the GATT. This was in the 19th century, but it was, yeah. I mean, the idea is that some cost differential is totally legitimate.
I hope Trump doesn't discover that statute.
Yeah. Right, because then there would be no international trade, and then we'd all be poorer. I mean, yeah. Let me get these other ones up here, and then we can talk about whatever. So, this one is interesting. So, geopolitical risk, and I don't really love this as a variable because it's very political. But basically, I think their idea is, if a country accepts this particular project, is this going to be part of this big global U.S.-China confrontation or not? Like, so if like Sri Lanka, they build a port, China ends up owning the port and uses it for their navy. That would be a project that these people would say, well, there's a serious geopolitical risk if you go ahead with that project, because it could end up at the center of these military geopolitical disputes. I mean, for some countries that would be good. Like, they don't care. Like, they'd be happy to be on China's side or America's side or whatever in the big global dispute. But I suppose it is important. Like, if you're a smaller country, you should probably think about how some particular project could implicate your wider international relations, especially in Trump world, So you want to prosecute a politician, it turns out he's Trump's friend, suddenly you have 100% tariffs. I mean, that's not the way the world used to work. But yeah, in Trump world, or Xi Jinping, right? If I suppose if the big countries see geopolitical stuff and trade closely linked, then all these projects have some potential.
There's an argument, I think,
that you need, that a developing, I mean, these are all instructions for, or not, these are all suggestions for developing countries. Right? You're thinking about a project funded by China. Think about this stuff.
Yeah, because assuming that there is this geopolitical stuff, and then you receive a lot of investment from China, and you're close to the U.S., and then you become a menace to the U.S.
Yeah.
Like in Panama,
Yeah.
Panama was in a way at risk, because then you have the two big brothers fighting for your land.
Right.
Not good thing.
Right. I mean, you could say that. I mean, that could happen with Venezuela too. I mean, I think China has bought a lot of oil from Venezuela over the years. I think there's it's not discussed in here, but I think that this China Export Bank, I think they funded oil production in Venezuela, and then in exchange they got long-term contracts to get Venezuelan oil. So let's say Maduro is replaced by somebody who's pro-US, it could cut the other way. Does that person want to have does he or she want to bring in the American oil companies into Venezuela? That's going to make China upset. Yeah. I just feel bad as an American. I feel kind of bad. Like, what? You shouldn't have to worry about what my CIA guys are going to think of your project, but maybe. And then environmental. Right, that's pretty obvious, and a lot of these are infrastructure projects. So of course, and the track record, in this, the investments that these guys studied, the track record is pretty bad. Now, is it worse than local projects? I mean, if you're in Ecuador, would it be worse if an Ecuador company built the dam than if a Chinese company built the dam? It might be bad either way if a country has weak environmental protection in general. But the Chinese are not going to insist on higher environmental standards. It's not like you're dealing with the Norwegians or something. They're not gonna, and there won't be pressure from home. So the home, in the U.S. and Europe, there are NGOs who watch these things and criticize the companies for bad environmental behavior. So,
And suing, actually, right?
yeah,
Some
yeah.
Brazilian companies are facing lawsuits in Europe.
Over Brazilian construction projects in
Brazil, yeah.
yeah.
In England and in the Netherlands. So,
For Amazon agricultural stuff or
for mining issues in Minas that had very substantial effects in the river. So Vale, the Brazilian mining company, is being sued in England.
Wow.
And another one, I think is BHP is because it's a joint venture. But there's one case, billionaire case against, I'm not sure if it's JBS or some meat company. I'm not sure, but there was an environmental issue. I think one of the companies that were involved in Lava Jato, and now they had a problem in the Northeast. Not sure if it's not Alagoas.
It's Braskem had a problem.
Braskem, yeah, Braskem. So they're being sued by NGOs, and it's a very interesting because who's financing this litigation? But anyway, it's another topic. But I cannot imagine the Chinese government being sued in China for an NGO. Yeah.
No, that won't happen. And their environmental record at home is pretty bad, but ours used to be bad too. I mean, in the U.S., it's and particularly with building dams. I hate dams, but the Chinese love dams. They're big. They use a lot of concrete. The engineers get to design. They're building one in another giant dam out in the Tibet region above India and these rivers that flow south down into other countries. And so let's see. So what is, and then there's a last one. So what term they use is corruption prone. So, and this one I also I'm not in love with the way they analyze this problem, because what they do is they go to one of those international corruption indices, so like Transparency International or somebody, and they look up where the host country is on that index. So if your country is ranked 180 out of 200, the idea is that your country is more likely, your government is more likely to be corruptible, and that's an issue. Like, so if you're in Denmark and you're considering a Chinese project, you can be fairly sure that your government is not going to be corrupted by the investor, I guess. I mean, that's the theory. But they base it off one of these third-party corruption indexes, which I think are kind of garbage in, garbage. Yeah, it's mostly perception of corruption. I mean, think the indexes are created different ways, but often it's just asking business people, like, how corrupt do you think China is? Is it more corrupt than?
So you don't buy that index?
I mean, they show something, but also
not to use as a proxy of prone to corruption.
Yeah.
your index is high, then you don't need to receive foreign investment.
That would be the thing, or it's more dangerous. So I'm a citizen in Peru. The Peruvian government is talking about having some Chinese company come in and build a mine, operate a mine. As a Peruvian citizen, what am I supposed to think about this? Is it dangerous? Is it not dangerous? So I run through these factors. And this one, I'm supposed to think, how corrupt is my government? Is my government really corrupt? If my government's really corrupt, I should be more worried about this project. If my government's really clean, then maybe I should feel okay. And there's some sense to that, actually.
I can bring a different argument saying the corruption and the case of Brazil. Brazil is a mid-size, mid-corrupt, not very high, but there's a book about corruption here, a famous one from Lazzarini, from INSPEC. It's a sort of crony capitalism, or but the corruption comes from the inside, not from the outside. So I could raise the argument that having foreign investment that could decrease the power
Yeah.
of companies,
Right.
you know, so we could balance or rebalance
Right.
the economic power.
Right.
And menace the companies that are corrupting the government.
This one, they may be thinking of a fairly simple model of just bribes, you know. Yeah.
But one of the main arguments used by the investors is how like all the context of a country is corrupted, and if you don't accept to pay bribes, for example, you cannot like get a contract in this place. So I don't see why bringing companies that are not corrupted to a place that is corrupted could change the environment of the place and the way things work nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of related to Luciano's point. I think, yeah, it's like, I mean, one way you could talk about that is blaming the victim. Like the companies that want the contract, the government people are saying, you need to pay us a bribe. So who's the victim? Is the victim the country, or is the victim the company that wants to do the thing? The discourse around corruption is very interesting. If you dig into it, there are a lot of assumptions in there. And this one, yeah, it seems like what they're thinking is, does my government demand bribes for things, or will they accept bribes for things? And if that's likely, then it increases the risk, and it may increase the risk of these other things, like environmental harms too. Like if you know your government officials can be bought with bribes, what are the foreign investors going to want? They're going to want, what will they want their bribe to pay for? They'll want their bribe to pay for no environmental protection or something like that, or higher. If they're operating the company, they'll want higher royalty rates or something like that. So they'll pay the bribe they'll pay the bribe to make the overall deal more advantageous for the company and less advantageous for the country, I guess. But I would just say in general that the global discourse around corruption is worth pulling apart a little bit for that reason. Sometimes it doesn't make a ton of sense. But, you know, anyway, so those are their 7 variables. And then their suggestion is, you know, like I said, this think tank, I think, is pretty, they're a little bit anti-China, or they're a little bit hawkish, what we would say hawkish on China, but maybe just because they're a little more, their focus is also on security issues. So the security people are just a little more hawkish. But whatever, I think their list of things to think about is pretty useful. So
it's good to grade on the same level.
Yeah.
Like China's investment.
Right, and if you
Objective methods to visualize.
yeah, I mean, it's, you know, because we have this habit of talking about the Chinese as if it's like, you know, and you know, and then you could say, well, you know, if we have Japanese companies come in and build our subway instead of Chinese companies, how would it be different if these were Japanese companies instead of Chinese companies or American companies or whatever?
I still prefer, generally speaking, not China against whatever. I still prefer a country in which, of course, I'm a lawyer and I'm biased for that, but I prefer a country that I can sue the other government in an independent court.
Yeah.
So that we're seeing what's happening in the US, the government is being challenged in courts. I mean, and is losing many cases, you know.
Right.
So if there's a country in which you don't have media, all the problems of media, but courts, independent courts, and you have a party who controls politics.
Yeah, it's
So that's one advantage of the United States.
And the government being liable.
Yeah, the one being liable, the one can be changed.
yeah.
If they take wrong decisions. So that's the case. The problem nowadays is that politics is becoming so pervasive, and I think that's the importance of this course that you're offering. Is try to separate things. So one thing is politics. Oh, I hate Trump. Let's understand what's going on. Or I hate China. Let's understand and try to separate. Even the Supreme Court, we have been discussing, right? I mean, is the Supreme Court of the U.S. Trumpist or originalist?
Yeah.
And that's a legal also discussion.
Right. That's the big picture, and I don't know. I have no answer to that. I think the internet has just changed fundamentally how things work, you know. And maybe it's a little better. I mean, people in the Chinese government tries to cut off the internet. I mean, they have the great firewall of China, but everybody can get around it with VPNs and stuff like that. So, sort of the global civil society is a real thing. But I wish. Well, so one question that's really interesting and is not dealt with in this, it would be sort of like legal risk or something. You could put another one on here and say, because China has been trying to build their own parallel dispute settlement system. They call it the foreign related rule of law, something like this. And what does the foreign related rule of law mean? It's a slogan they use. I think what it means, they've been investing a lot in trying to get dispute settlement on these deals moved to China under Chinese law. So they're training judges to handle international commercial matters. I think they've set up some special tribunals, and I'm pretty sure that in these contracts, if the Chinese party is really the stronger party, then the dispute resolution terms in the contract will be dispute resolution in China before one of these bodies under Chinese law. So I sort of get it, but they're obsessed with being like the U.S. Like they look at the U.S. and they think, God, the Americans, they get all this stuff. They control the global legal discourse, and they're trying to unseat the U.S. from that. Which, okay, go ahead. It's like replacing the dollar with the renminbi. I mean, I don't think anybody really understands what the advantage of that would be exactly. I mean, you could have some transactions in renminbi instead of dollars as the reserve currency. Maybe that would really benefit China economically, but also I think there's this national pride thing involved, or just power politics, that Xi Jinping and those guys somehow think if you could unseat the dollar and then the renminbi would be the global exchange currency, that somehow that would make China more powerful in some power way. And I think that's just for them. That's just a separate concern from the actual economics of it. And maybe, and would developing countries benefit if they could transact in renminbi instead of in dollars? I don't know.
The only the U.S. has the advantage that the country has the credits in the same currency as the debts.
Right.
But for a foreign country, I mean, what's the difference between being in debt in dollars or another currency? I mean, it's not your own currency, and
Yeah.
you're
And I don't think China is going to be nicer to you than the U.S. I mean, but I think the dispute resolution thing is really interesting, and we'll just have to see whether it matters, and because there's this lack of transparency, I just don't know, and I don't know what people's experience is in here with when their clients have transactions with China. What does the dispute resolution provision say now? But I'm sure that one of the goals of this going out thing, one of the goals is to have dispute resolution done in China by Chinese law firms, Chinese arbitrators, Chinese judges, the whole thing, and have Chinese governing law. But as you say, when there's no judicial independence, and on one hand, Xi Jinping is saying, we're Marxists. We reject separation of powers. As an ideological matter, we reject separation of powers. That's a bourgeois blah blah thing. So the party's always in charge. And then you say, we want dispute resolution in China. I don't know. I guess if you...
I had bad experiences that I cannot generalize, but at CITAC, Chinese arbitration center. I mean, Chinese language, Chinese law. No, but I don't accept the clause. Is not saying that. Whatever, and then how can I defeat this judgment in a court if the court is not independent? So
right.
very problematic. But in the old times, we could use Hong Kong.
Not anymore. Singapore, or right. No, I don't know. And so then the countries with weaker bargaining power, their disputes will be decided in China, and then the countries with more bargaining power, they can maybe escape this and get international arbitration. Yeah.
How easy or difficult it is to make lobbying in China if you are a foreigner? To get the right connections and buy a gift for a communist.
Well, I'd say there's no such thing as lobbying in the normal English sense of lobbying. That lobbying for us means you hire some law firm in Washington, and they send their lawyers to the staff of the Congress people, and they try to, I mean, there are bribes and things, of course, everywhere, but you can't do that in China. Who would you lobby in the normal way? You can't do lobbying. You can try to use connections. They have a whole term. You should know that this is probably the one term you should know in Chinese. It's two words, but they put them to guanxi. So Xi is pronounced the same as Xi Jinping's last name, guanxi. Guanxi means connections in China. And it's sort of like social capital in a Western language. It's your network. It's your network of people you know, and the people who you know, who do they know? And it expands out, and and if you're a foreigner, it's very risky to play this game because you don't. I mean, if you're actually bribing somebody and you get caught, it's a big problem. And of course, like we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the U.S., so the U.S. government they've been very aggressive about prosecuting American companies who bribe foreign government officials.
No, but I'm not talking exactly about bribing.
Yeah.
but about exerting some kind of influence.
Yeah. Sure.
I was thinking about more about cultural norms. If the Chinese, especially the Chinese in government, if if they receive something to talk about some issue, they are more closed and don't allow a lot of talk. Enough as we talk in Brazil.
Yeah.
Relation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how open they are to.
The government officials have to be very careful now because Xi Jinping has been carrying out these anti-corruption campaigns, and the anti-corruption since he got power, which is over 10 years ago, he's been doing anti-corruption campaigns internally with the party officials and the government officials. So those people now are very, very careful about having dinners with. They prosecute people for spending too much money on dinners. They look at your receipts and of course everybody did this in China because it's a Guanxi society, right? So everybody was used to, and gift giving. Like, if I go to China and I give a talk, I get some gift, or students. My students go home for a couple months and then they come back, they bring me something. And I'm probably supposed to report it to somebody because I'm a state employee, but I don't do that. But it's little things like a bottle of scotch. And this is very Asian. Like if you don't do this, if you don't play the game, you seem like you're kind of a bad person. One of my Japanese graduate students brought me this lovely bottle of scotch, and I couldn't give it back to him and say, no, I can't accept your bottle of scotch. But the Taiwanese bring me pineapple cookies because our Taiwanese students know that I love these pineapple cookies from Taiwan, and they always bring me pineapple cookies. It's deeply part of the culture of little gift giving and reciprocity, and you have to do it. But yeah, it's very difficult for foreigners. So foreigners typically have hired Chinese people just to do this. But that doesn't get you away from the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act liability. Like you can't.
It's dangerous to branch with government officials.
Well, if you hire a Chinese person to do the stuff, if it's illegal, it's illegal. Even though you can't outsource that. Of course, that was the first thing they tried, right? They said, well, we can't bribe. I mean, we call him a bag man. Right, a bag man with a bag of money. I have a bag man. Like, of course, you would hire a local bag man, and he would go around doing what needed to be done. I mean, lawyers sometimes play that role. I mean, Chinese. So you would hire a Chinese law firm, and they would have people in the firm that were sort of had a lot of guanxi with. I mean, that's kind of universal, right? But
Brazil, we have kind of flexibility on that. Judges often receive lawyers from one or the other part in their cabinet to discuss the case. This is given as normal here in Brazil, and also like the circular door.
The revolving door.
Yeah. In government, then go to the private market, then goes back and I think in China this isn't common.
No, they don't. No, people, and this is a kind of structural difference. There, typically the way it works there is people. And this is a civil law thing too. I think people who join the judiciary, become judges. It's often the first job. Right, they get out of school, they do well, they join the judiciary as a junior judge, and then they move up the judiciary as their career. But the judiciary is a pyramid, so at some point some people can't move up. So those people then leave and go into private practice. So the U.S. is the opposite. Our judges are normally lawyers first, and then they become judges But their system, and this is common in Asia, you know, a lot of former judges go out to become lawyers, and of course they have a lot of relationships with all the other judges, right? They're, you know, so in Korea, yeah, in Korea the joke was they would always win their first case. So if you really wanted to win your case, you go hire the guy who just retired from being a judge, and his or her other friends would, you know, they would win the case. China has not. They were actually in the before Xi Jinping, they were talking about bringing business people into the party. Like successful business people would join the party, and I think that's kind of stopped. I don't think Xi Jinping really wants that, because that might liberalize the party. There might be less party discipline. You know, if you have some guy like Jack Ma, right? He owns Alibaba. If you invite him into the party, he's got his own ideas. He has his own sort of power, and I think Xi Jinping has kind of reversed that. Although I don't know, but that was a thing for a while. I think that the reformers were trying to push was to invite successful business people into the party. Yeah, but I would say the bribery stuff is the anti-bribery stuff of Xi Jinping has made it more complicated. And you know, they prosecuted some people in Beijing for doing due diligence work. So, and this is one of the reasons the foreign law firms are leaving China, because the foreign law firms, that was part of what they did. They did due diligence for their foreign clients on Chinese companies. And they would either, you know, hire lawyers or Chinese staff involved in doing the due diligence on Chinese companies. And in Xi Jinping world, they've expanded the concept of national secrets and, you know, and security, national security. They've expanded that to include, well, the boundaries are very vague. So they went after people for violating national secrets laws. And the people said, well, we're just doing due diligence. You have to get economic information. And China's sort of new approach to public security was that basic information about the economy could be considered like a national secret. So an American company, and it didn't take very many examples, but there was an American company in Beijing that had been there for a long time, and they raided the office publicly with the TV cameras and the prosecutors, and they go in, and they usually arrest the Chinese staff. I mean, the Chinese staff are the ones the foreigners usually just get kicked out, but the Chinese staff are at real risk. And so it's very complicated now.
About the economic data that could be considered like a national secret.
Yeah.
Can we trust economic data from China, like GDP or something?
Oh, that stuff?
Yeah. Because, you know,
No.
as an economist, I saw a paper that tried to use like the lights that satellites can, as a proxy to GDP. But how is China doing about this?
Yeah, that's debated a little bit. I think it depends on what you want the data for. So there's one of our alumni is one of the top Americans who studies the Chinese economy. And he's at the Peterson Institute in Washington, the PIIE, which it used to be something else, and Peterson gave them money, so now it's the Peterson Institute. But they're like the leading think tank in Washington for international trade. Very good. And there's a guy named Nick Lardy who's been studying the Chinese economy for like 40 years. And Nick he gets data. He tries to be very fact-based, which is good, you know. And I would say Nick Lardy's stuff is always worth reading on the Chinese economy. And
Can I have?
yeah. I think he might be retired now, and he's at PEI. EIIE in Washington. He says that the data, as long as you're careful with what you're, like the questions you're asking, you can get useful data. And that makes sense to me because China, like other authoritarian countries, they're weirdly obsessed with statistics and data. Like this is Hannah Arendt, right? That, you know, they're just a bunch of crazy bureaucrats and they collect data on everything. So there's tons of data. But as we talked about the other day, the lower level officials have an incentive to lie because their career promotion has been based on like GDP growth in their district. So that was part of the what they call the cadre evaluation system. And so everybody down, they have a system to they have an incentive to overestimate GDP growth. And that goes from the bottom up to, you know. So GDP growth and GDP growth figures have become like a national obsession. It used to be 8. So there was some mythology around this. Like who came up with the number 8? That they had to hit 8% GDP growth every year. 8 is a lucky number in Chinese because it sounds like wealth. Like it's ba is the number 8, but fa means to get wealthy. So 8 is a lucky number. There are lots of lucky numbers or lucky and unlucky numbers. So one theory was they came up with 8 because it was lucky. It's a lucky number.
Is 13 unlucky?
Maybe from the West. 4 is an unlucky number because it sounds like death. A lot of things have to do with what sounds like what. So if you go in a Chinese elevator, at least in the old days, there was no 4th floor because 4 was but so raw GDP numbers are fake, and also it's still going on. And also one possible source of the 8 was just something that Deng Xiaoping said at some meeting or somewhere. So for years they were fixated on hitting 8% growth, and all the officials in the system knew that. And so and they would always hit 8% growth. And you know, that's one reason they do things like overfunding real estate construction. Because, you know, you build all these empty cities that nobody lives in, but the construction counts in the macro GDP numbers. Now they're talking about 5. I just saw something the other day that 5 seems to be the new official target, and they look like they're a little below 5 in reality. So there'll be some priming thing.
Must be careful because they can be close to 4.
They'll never 4. 4 will never be the target for GDP growth. So yeah, it's a mixed picture. Lardy, I don't know exactly what Lardy gets, but we had this discussion the last time he was at Wisconsin because somebody asked him the same question. It was like, well, you're an economist, you study China. What about this issue? And he was more. He's a Midwesterner. He's a realist, and he said, well, it depends on what you're interested in. Some data is very useful for certain kinds of questions, and then other data is just not. So the idea of studying like satellite images, that was famously used by one of the Chinese leaders, Li Keqiang, who ended up getting pushed out by Xi Jinping. He had his own metric, and I think it was train traffic, because you can't fake train traffic. You can get data, how many trains went where, at what time, how many cars were in the train. You could get train data that was, you know, probably nobody thought to fake it, because nobody, you know. And then you would extrapolate from train traffic to get to like some picture of the actual economic activity.
Maybe now with AI, you can start to.
Yeah, I think the satellite stuff is probably still, I mean, if you combine satellite images and train traffic, you'd probably get some pretty.
Let me just, because now we have more people.
Yeah.
Tomorrow we're gonna merge with. I'm gonna write down here the room. It's 301. So we're gonna merge other class from antitrust professor. This room, the same? No, but we were
But in what building?
supposedly. Do you know which building that Vicente is going to teach?
It's gonna be here. I
Here?
guess it's gonna be in this class actually.
Oh,
so
good.
It was by nature
Good.
combined. So a professor from Glasgow is going to talk about politics of antitrust, and we're going to talk about politics of international commerce. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion. It's 9:30.
Oh, it's 9:30 tomorrow? Okay.
So today is so beautiful that I will bring Professor to Vista Restaurant so that we can enjoy the view of the city.
Oh,
And
nice.
it's one of a few places in which you can have a sort of panoramic
Oh,
view.
cool. Cool. That's one thing in if you want to understand a little bit about Asia, Tokyo has this Tokyo Tower that's sort of like the Eiffel Tower. And it's like, so, when they were developing, they wanted to be European, they wanted to be like world level. So they did things like that. Like hosting the Olympics is a huge thing in Asia. Hosting the Olympics is a sign that you have grown up as a country. And then, so Korea built a tower. So if you go to Seoul, there's the Seoul Tower in the middle of Seoul, and it was built during the authoritarian period. And remember, they also hosted the Olympics in 1988, and a lot of people think that was right as authoritarianism was ending in Korea, and it was kind of a sense that a lot of people thought it was time for the authoritarian thing to end, and to become a normal country. Which is really interesting, and China it's kind of like that now with China. They're I think they're looking out and seeing what other countries have done at different stages, and so they hosting the Olympics for China was a huge thing, and unfortunately it didn't really kickstart political reform. That's kind of the difference. It's I think they really think that they can separate economic and political reform and keep them separate. So.
Any other question, or we made our professor work too hard
I've been
today?
working.
Not so.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah. That was fun.